So I need to make a confession to you all. First of all, I don't really remember much from last week. So y'all were here, you heard the announcement that my sister-in-law passed away, and we found out on Sunday morning. We went through the motions. I don't know what that sermon was like. So however that was for y'all, I'm sorry. Thank you for letting me be a pastor even when I'm going through this. But I must confess to you that I haven't really been feeling this sermon series. Most of these practices are so new to me that I feel like I'm preaching to you about something that I don't actually have much experience with. It's an uncomfortable feeling for me. I like to feel like I know what I'm talking about when I get up here behind this pulpit. It's an interesting feeling because it feels like I'm preaching these sermons to myself too. I'm inviting myself to be open to these new practices. I'm inviting myself to be open to new connections with God. But since it's a new place for me, I'm just not exactly preaching from a place of comfort or confidence, and I don't quite know how to handle that. We were in Texas all week long. We left on Sunday right after church. We got back late on Friday. They think that my sister-in-law had a heart attack in her sleep. And just didn't wake up on Sunday morning. She had just turned 43 on June 12th, so it was just a big shock for all of us. And so when we got there, Aaron and I were really kind of thrust into the motions of making decisions for the family, for the funeral, for all of the things. We were the ones who were doing all of the different things, and so there wasn't a whole lot of time for the two of us to grieve ourselves. We just were kind of in things we have to do and also parent our 3 children and also handle all the things. And I remember there was one time, there's a lake between where Aaron's parents live and where the funeral home was. And one time on our way back from the funeral home, we just pulled over and we stopped at that lake. And we got out and we just stood there for a moment and looked at the water. And it was just this feeling of like we could breathe for a moment. And I really felt God's presence there. And I had this realization, this is landscape as theophany. That's one of our spiritual practices that we've talked about. This is me looking out onto this and experiencing God. And then that thought made me realize that we're in a threshold moment. We're in this moment where we know nothing will ever be the same, but we don't exactly know what things are going to look like in the future. And so I stopped and I said a short blessing of the prayer of a threshold, blessing the unknown. And I was like, I'm not really feeling the sermon series, but apparently I remember the practices. I was processing this with a friend of mine who I actually think might be a soul friend, and she helped me realize something. Maybe these aren't practices that are going to become a part of our everyday realities. Maybe not every time we walk through a threshold of a door, we're going to say a threshold prayer. Maybe we won't always have dreams. Maybe we don't always find the landscape to be a place where we experience God. Maybe they aren't going to instantly change our lives and immediately elevate our connection to the Holy One. But maybe they'll hang out in our back pocket as another tool in our tool belt, to be pulled out, to be remembered when we need it most, when we need another way of connecting with God, connecting with God's presence. If you had asked 20-year-old me about ways to connect with God, I would have said, you read your Bible and you pray. And that's it. And now I can talk about landscape as theophany and thresholds and dreams and soul friends and other things. So if you're like me and you're not really feeling this sermon series either, I do hope and pray that these practices are bringing us a new awareness of ways that we can connect with God, ways that God is present and at work all around us if we can be more aware. So with that in mind, we're talking about our next spiritual practice today, and it is the Celtic practice of Peregrinatio. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly, but that is how I will continue to pronounce it. Peregrinatio. It is seeking the place of resurrection. Peregrinatio is a journey. Maybe it's a physical journey, or maybe it's a mental or spiritual one, but it's a journey where the path is unclear. It's mysterious by nature. It's the kind of journey mentioned by the poet Antonio Machado when he says, "Wanderer, there is no path. The road is made by walking." Wanderer, there is no path. The road is made by walking. Peregrinatio is a journey that seeks to bring new life, to find the things that bring us new life. It's seeking a place of resurrection for anything in us that needs resurrection, which might be different things at different times. And this really stems from these verses that Nancy read for us in Genesis 17. These verses are the basis that developed this Celtic practice. So in the verses that Nancy just read, we heard about how God solidified the covenant with Abram. It's in these verses where God says to Abram and Sarai, "Walk before me and be blameless." It's in these verses where God gives them new names and changes their name from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah to represent this transformed nature. And they are currently in the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised them. And here we are, all the way in Genesis 17, verse 1. And this new thing happens. "Walk before me and be blameless, and no longer will you be called this. You're going to have a different name." But this passage in Genesis 17 is not the first time we hear about Abraham. It's not anywhere near the beginning of his journey. I'm going to give you a very, very quick recap. But Abram is first mentioned way back in chapter 11, right after the Tower of Babel, when we get his lineage. And then in chapter 12 is when God calls Abram and Sarai to leave the place that they've known, to leave their home and their father's household. And I believe the instructions are, "Go to the land that I will show you." Just start walking, guys. Go ahead. I'll show you when to stop. That happens in chapter 12. Then we continue to read about their journey. In chapter 13, we read that their flocks are so huge that Abram and Lot have to split because they don't have enough space for them. And presumably at this point, they're already in the land of Canaan. And then in chapter 14, we read about how Lot gets kidnapped by people who are in a conflict in the area. And Abram starts meeting with all of these kings to try to get him back. And then he calls for 300 trained men from his own household. So now we know he's got a lot of wealth in the form of flocks and a lot of power in the form of a massive household. And he's hanging out with kings. The Bible never tells us that Abram is a king, but clearly he and Sarah had political power in this new region. And then in chapter 15 is when God solidifies the covenant with Abraham. And this is when God tells him, "I will make you the father of many nations." And Abram's like, "But I don't have any kids yet." And God's like, "It's going to be okay. I got you." And then chapter 16, Sarai's like, "I don't think God's got us. Let's make this happen ourselves." And she gives Hagar to Abram. Most of us know that story. One day we'll talk about how horribly toxic that whole situation was. So we go through all of these things, and then we hit chapter 17, where God says, "Walk before me and be blameless, and I'm giving you a new name." So there are two interesting things here. First, they've already arrived at the land of Canaan. They've already arrived at the place where God told them to go. They've been there for a while now. So what does God mean by saying, "Walk before me"? Where are they supposed to go next? And that's the other thing. God saying, "Walk before me." God doesn't say, "Follow me." God doesn't say, "I will lead you." God doesn't say, "Walk in the path I've set out for you." God says, "Walk before me. Walk in front of me. You go first." But again, where are they going? Some people suggest that God wasn't calling them to another outward journey, but to an inward one. Perhaps the next stage for them of walking before God was an internal transition. To walk before God and to be blameless was a journey of transformation now that they had arrived in the land that God had for them. Perhaps their new names are the signs of them being transformed from the inside out. They've arrived physically, but now they have other internal spiritual work to do to step into a new and different kind of beginning. This is the idea of peregrinatio. a journey that could be outward or internal. It's mysterious with no clear signs about how long it's going to last or how far it's going to take you or when it's going to end. And in this journey, there is no set path. God is not inviting you to follow the path that God has laid out. God is inviting you to walk and let the Spirit of God be like the thing that's supporting you from behind, the current at your back. But you get to go where there are no steps already. You get to make the path as you walk it. In Peregrinatio, we are the travelers leading the way, looking for the place of resurrection. We still have to pay attention to that movement behind us. We have to pay attention to its curves and its pushes and its nudges, to allow those to change us and to help us seek the different things that God may be trying to show us. But there is no clear path for this journey. And this is also not an unending journey. We often use the metaphor of journey to describe our spiritual lives. We're all on a journey with Jesus. I say this all the time. I don't hate that metaphor. I like it a lot. That's not the same thing as this, though. This is not the generic, we're all on a journey with Jesus. This is a very specific journey that we go on that has an end point. Eventually, you do arrive at your place of resurrection. And you'll know it when it happens. That's what the book said. You'll just know it. I'm like, that's super helpful, everybody. That's super helpful. But it's kind of like Genesis when God says, go to the land that I will show you. As we go on these peregrinatios, seeking our place of resurrection for whatever it may mean. And we'll get into it a little bit more in just a second. As we go, we listen for the Spirit. We listen and we look for those things that are bringing new life in us. And we will know when we have found it because God will show us. So I wonder, as I'm really working my way through this sermon, I wonder how many of you have been on a journey like that. I wonder if there's anything in your life that you could look back on and say, I think that was a peregrinatio. I think that was kind of this unknown journey and I didn't know where it was going to take me or how it was going to end up. I think I went on one when I decided to go back to seminary the second time. That was the point where I had stopped running from my calling. It was the point where I was still worried that I was a woman who felt called to preach. I had been convinced that no one would ever let me do it, and I had been running from it for 10 years. And in that moment, I decided, I'm just going to do this next thing. I'm going to go to seminary. If I am ever going to be a preacher, I know that I need a different type of degree for that. I didn't know what it would mean. I didn't know where it would take me. In fact, one of my professors showed us a sheet that she sent out during the very first week of class that said, are you ordained? And do you want to be ordained? And I said no and no. I didn't think that journey, I didn't know where it was going to take me. All I knew was this was the next step. And it was me stepping into this unknown thing, looking for some kind of resurrection in my own life. Sometimes we find ourselves on a peregrinatio when we've experienced some sudden change, like the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job. And we find ourselves on a journey through something that we don't exactly know how to walk through, and we have no idea what things are going to look like on the other side. Sometimes our peregrinatio comes because something just isn't sitting right. Maybe things just keep being hard in a way that doesn't really make sense, or we just kind of have this unsettling feeling in our spirit. Maybe we have these old habits or patterns that are just really no longer serving us well, and we know something needs to change, something needs to give, and we feel this pull towards something different or deeper, and we take a time of discernment to try to understand why. Peregrinatio means being willing to step into the unknown, the scary, uncomfortable, mysterious unknown, and see what we'll discover about God and about ourselves there. I didn't intend for this to happen, but as I was writing this sermon, I actually couldn't stop thinking about this particular practice and the LGBTQ community. It really wasn't intentional, but it happened nonetheless. I've heard so many stories from our gay and trans friends as they find themselves in a peregrinatio, especially those who are Christians. These stories often involve an unsettling, mysterious, fearful kind of journey to understand themselves and their paradigms, to understand how to find life again and what that even means and what it means to find life in Christ and live authentically as a follower of Jesus. It can be a very scary journey. My first introduction to this came from a blog post called Blue Babies Pink. And I'm going to say that again because I want y'all to write it down, and I think you should all go look it up. It is amazing. It's called Blue Babies Pink. He says it comes from a doctor. A doctor was interviewed, and they asked him, obstetrician, and they asked him what his passion was. And he said, "My passion is turning blue babies pink." Anyway, this blog post, Blue Babies Pink, it tells the story of a man named Brett, and it tells his story in small, bite-sized episodes. You can read one at a time and then go through. They put it out as a blog post or as a podcast. He is the youngest of 3 sons, born into a loving pastor's family. He's a committed follower of Christ, and he tells the story of discovering and then reckoning with his own sexuality while being a committed Christian. And it's a story filled with his own discomfort and fear and concern for his own soul. And he really takes you through this journey. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but he eventually finds his place of resurrection. He eventually finds his place of new life. I see similar things with people all the time who are going through a religious deconstruction. They know that something about their church or their belief system or the way their Christianity has manifested thus far is no longer serving them, is no longer sitting right anymore. There's just something about it that feels off. And for those who are trying to listen or discern, who are trying to follow the Spirit, they find themselves on a journey into what Sarah Bessie calls the wilderness. Sometimes it leads to new practices. Sometimes it leads them to new churches, and sometimes it leads them away from church altogether. But they start this journey not knowing what it'll look like on the other side. They are walking where there is no road, walking before God as the winds of the Spirit support them from behind. So how do we actually do this? How do we actually practice peregrinatio in our regular everyday lives, especially since it's a journey that seems to be kind of specific for a certain specific amount of time? Well, I think one of the ways we start is one of the ways that all of these spiritual practices start, which is by being aware, practicing more mindfulness. Ignatius of Loyola came up with this prayer called the Examen, and it has a few steps, but one of the things he encourages people to do is at the end of your day, sit down and think back through your day. And notice those places that brought you joy. Notice the moments or the activities that brought you peace and comfort, that made your soul come alive. And then also notice the activities or moments that did the opposite. Where did you feel major frustration? What made you really angry? What did you engage in that felt soul-sucking? And if we'll start noticing those things, trusting that God is present in them, and ask God to show us what this means. God, what are you trying to show me in my anger? What are you trying to show me about why I got so mad at this? What are you trying to teach me about these things that bring me joy and new life? Where do I need resurrection? Where do I need transformation? And as we begin listening, as we begin being aware, we might find ourselves on a journey of peregrinatio, seeking more of those things that bring us new life, seeking more of those things that bring us resurrection. I'm not really feeling this sermon either. I hope you're still with me. Are you with me? There's no jokes. I normally like to be a little bit funnier than this. Sorry. I'm going to end with this story. I was asked to preach my sister-in-law's funeral this past Thursday. I think many of you know that. And it was by far the hardest sermon I've ever written. And a part of that, I think, a small part of it, but part of it was the pressure that I felt because my father-in-law warned me that I will be in a room full of Southern Baptists who do not believe that women can preach. No, to be fair, I know some Southern Baptists who think the women can preach. So not all of them are like that. But he was like, so just FYI, do us proud. Thanks so much. And I realized as I was working on this that I am so far beyond that. It's been over 4 years since I've been a church where anyone hesitated over a woman's ability to preach or lead, and it's just not a part of my reality anymore. It's a non-story, like Kathy said. The Peregrinatio that started with me going back to seminary ended with me being here with all of you this morning. And I forget what it was even like to live in that other place. I forget what it was even like, at least in that regard. There are certainly other places in my life that need resurrection, but that one has been settled. Thanks in large part, by the way, to this church. And it is my hope and my prayer that this church can be a part of all sorts of peregrinatios, helping all sorts of people on their journey toward their place of resurrection. Whether that's people like me who have often been limited by churches, or people of various sexualities and gender identities who have often been rejected by churches, or people who have questions and doubts and a wandering faith who have often been dismissed by churches. Because we know that no matter how churches have responded, the Spirit of God does not limit or reject or dismiss anyone. I hope that all of us, sooner or later, as we enter into our own journeys, that we will seek our places of resurrection that we need in our life. And I hope that this church will continue to be a place and a people that encourages others on that journey. May it be so. Amen.